Glad to have you with us today. Of course, we've just ridden over one of the oldest railroad lines in this area, completed in 1858 as the East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia line. We crossed over 4 bridges and passed the pre-Civil War Missionary Ridge Tunnel. Now we're in East Chattanooga, which is basically the end of our line. What we're going to do is turn our locomotive around on a turntable. Now, turntables were very important during the days of steam engines. Steam locomotives are designed to operate forward primarily. Now, they can back up, but it's somewhat inefficient. The engineer has to turn around backwards. There's a coal tender blocking the view. By the way, did you all know that steam locomotives have tender behinds? Now you do. But anyway, since back in the day of steam engines, when they pulled into a station or a terminal, if they needed to go back the other direction maybe the next day, they'd almost always want to turn the locomotive around. Now, they didn't always do it with a turntable, but a lot of times they did. You can see this doesn't take up a lot of space, the way the turntable is set up. You pull on, you rotate, you pull off, and you're done. There's actually 2 other ways to turn a train or part of a train. One of them we have at Grand Junction. It's called a Y track. It's like a triangle. The depot's actually sitting in the middle of that triangle track. Before we pull forward through a switch, back up around a second track through another switch, and then forward again. In those 3 movements, we can turn a locomotive or a train around depending on the size. The third way, which is not as common, is called a balloon track. That's where you have a switch off a main track, makes a big loop, and actually comes back into that same switch. That takes a lot of real estate, you might say. So that's the least common form of turning a locomotive or part of a train. Now, this turntable, let me say one more thing. When the diesel engines came along, turntables were really no longer needed. Most diesel electric locomotives were designed to operate forward or reverse just about as easily. Therefore, didn't have to turn them around. Most of the turntables around the country were removed, scrapped, and lost to history. So we are lucky to have our turntable, although it is fairly short. But this is an 80-foot turntable. It was built in 1916, originally installed in Macon, Georgia. It was later moved to Cedartown. Now, the reason it was moved is because the locomotives were getting too large for this turntable in Macon. It was a major terminal. So they took this turntable out and installed a 100 or 110-foot turntable to accommodate the larger locomotives. This table was moved to Cedartown on a branch line where they had smaller engines. So it worked out just fine. But it stayed in operation in Cedartown until we purchased it, moved it here to East Chattanooga, restored it, and installed it here in East Chattanooga. It was first used on July 4th, 1982. This is a center balance turntable. Underneath, down here in the middle where you can't see, there's a big 6-foot bearing. That holds the weight. When we pull our engine on, it will actually balance over the center. Most of the weight in the middle and much less on the ends. Now, when this was a new turntable, it didn't have a motor on it. Had to be pushed around by hand. It took 4 men to push a locomotive around. They had leverage bars on either end. The hardest part was getting it started. Once it was moving, a little extra effort would keep it moving on around. Now, that having been said, you might say we got a little bit lazy here at the Railroad Museum. We added a 25 horsepower electric motor, and that's how we're going to turn not only the turntable, but the locomotive on top. And that's about 170 tons or so, and we're going to be turning it with 25 horsepower. So we're going to demonstrate the table at this time. We do ask you stay behind the yellow line on the ground there for your own safety. Now, this table is almost too small for engine 4501. It will fit, but the coupler knuckles will extend over the ends, and when we rotate, the coupler will be fairly close to those handrail stanchions, so we do want you to stay back and stay safe. Now, what we're seeing is the locomotive pull onto the turntable from track number 1. We'll rotate 180 degrees, but we will line up with the adjacent track. They'll pull off onto track number 2, and that will allow them to pull down past the train, go through a switch, back up, and reconnect onto the other end of our train. So what had been the last car will now be the first car on the return trip. So we're rolling onto the turntable. The tender is on now, partially. Here comes the last wheels. And when we make our stop in a moment, you'll notice that the end wheels will only be about a foot from either end of the rails there on the turntable. Very tight fit for 4501. All right, we're ready to rotate. We're going to give it a shot. Again, we ask you to stay back. Now let's talk about our locomotive. World famous steam engine number 4501. This engine was built in 1911 for the Southern Railroad. It was the very first Mikado type locomotive. Now Mikado refers to the wheel arrangement. It is a 282, 2 lead wheels, 8 driving wheels, and 2 trailing wheels underneath the firebox. That doesn't include the tender wheels, of course. But engine 4501 was the first Mikado. It was a successful type of an engine for them, for the Southern, and they purchased nearly 200 additional units. So 4501 was the first, and now it is the last. Engine 4501 stayed in operation for the Southern and freight service between 1911 and 1948. In 1948, they probably would have been scrapped as the diesel and electric engines were coming along to replace the steam locomotives. But it was purchased out of a deadline by the Kentucky and Tennessee Railway in Stearns, Kentucky. They needed a large steam locomotive for pulling coal cars up the mountain from their coal mine. So they purchased 4501, renumbered it K&T number 12, and used it all the way up until 1964. Now that was late in the game for operating steam engine, but like I said, they had their own fuel source, had their own coal, so it worked out pretty well for them. But finally in 1964, number 12, or 4501, became surplus to the K&T and affixed several of their other steam engines. And number 4501 was purchased by the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum's first president, Paul Merriman. He purchased the engine himself for $5,000. Somehow talked the Southern into bringing it down to Chattanooga. And that was 56 years ago. It was June 6, 1964. When it came down to Chattanooga. It became the cornerstone of the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum. It was restored to operation in 1966 and used back to the Southern Railroad for use on their passenger excursion trips. And it operated for them sporadically between 1966 and 1994. Came back to Chattanooga. We operated it for a few more years. 1998 was the last time it ran here. And at that time we thought it would be retired forever. Instead, in 2011, Norfolk Southern announced their 21st Century Steam program, and they wanted 4501 to be a part of it. We restored the locomotive, and that's why we get to enjoy it today. Now, the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum was founded in 1961 by a small group of local residents who were concerned about the disappearance of steam locomotives and passenger trains. They decided they would try to save a little bit of what we call the golden age of railroading, which is the period from about 1920 to 1950. We'll be celebrating our 60th anniversary next year, and we have been successful with our mission to preserve, restore, and operate historic railroading equipment with help from people like you. You all have bought a ticket today. That is helping us keep this history alive and keep the trains running. We do sincerely appreciate your help. Now we're going to head back over and reboard the train. By the way, if you have any other questions, feel free to ask myself, any of the crew members. We'll do our best to answer your questions, but I also need to give you a warning. Sometimes if we don't know the real answer, we just make something up that sounds good. You may need to Google it later. We're going to head back over and reboard the train. We'll load the red coach and the yellow, red and yellow first, and then green after that.